There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Thanks for coming. Can everyone see my screen? Pretty sure you can all see my screen, right? Hello, hello. We're just going to wait for some people to come in. We're just going to let it pour in and everything. But I'm so glad you could come tonight for our history webinar for OCA. Very excited. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and start a little bit. Yeah, let us know where you're watching in from. So hello everyone, my name is Lady Marie Balilan. I am OCA National's Senior Chapter Membership Development Associate. I'm also a history nerd on the side, but full-time. Thank you all so much for being here. This is our fourth webinar in our series of AAPI hate crimes in history. They're not new. So this is the fourth and last of this subject, unfortunately, but we have had 3 other webinars. In case you missed them, they are all on our OCA National YouTube channel. So if you wanted to catch up, feel free to go on there. But today we will be talking about a very meaningful subject, especially for myself as a Filipino American who was born in New York to immigrant parents who resonate with this storyline, and just learning about so much about Filipino Americans in history, the fact that they are, that they have been in this country for centuries and they've contributed to history for a very long time. I'm just so excited to share that with all of you. Obviously, we won't be going through with the entire Filipino American history, but we will be hitting some very important points. And mainly focusing on the exploitation of Filipino Americans throughout history, on the theme of their necessity and need for America's existence and being able to survive as a country, and them coming to the Philippines for that as a resource, and also exploiting us at the same time in unfair treatment, in unwelcome treatment as well. So the way that we're going to do this is I'll be going through a historical timeline of just breaking down events in history. And then I have 2 special speakers that I am so excited to introduce to you all later on. We will be discussing the things that we talk about, all the historical events that we've been talking about. And then we'll have a Q&A portion. So if you do have any questions that come up in your head as we go through the historical timeline, please feel free to use them, to put them in the Q&A tool that you should all see at the bottom of your screen. With that being said, we are going to get started. All right. So we're starting in 1587. So this is the first landing of Filipinos at Morro Bay. This was during the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade era from 1565 to 1815, where Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific between the Philippines and Mexico. A ship commanded by Pedro de Unamuno, the Spanish galleon Nuestra Senora de Esperanza entered Morro Bay, California, and a landing party was sent to shore, which included the Luzon Indios, marking the first landing of Filipinos in the continental United States. The landing party spent 3 days on Morro Bay and took official possession of the area for Spain by putting up a cross made of branches. The group was attacked by the Chumash people 2 days later, and one of the Filipinos was killed. Unamuno and his crew gave up further exploration of this part of the coast and left for their destination, which was Acapulco. No other Filipino landed in California for 12 years in 1595, when the Manila galleon St. Augustine was wrecked at Point Reyes, which was the first European ship to be wrecked on the Californian coast. Next, we have the end of the Spanish-American War on December 10th, 1898, where with the Treaty of Paris, Spain cedes the Philippines to the United States. So after 327 years of Spanish colonization from 1571 to 1898, the Philippines is now a colony of the United States of America. So they were colonized by America for 47 years. And from 1898 to 1901, the Philippines government was run by the US military. In 1901, the military government was replaced by civilian government, the insular government of the Philippine Islands, with William Howard Taft as its first governor general. Moving forward to 1904, this was the Philippine Reservation at the World Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. And the fair's core and most popular attraction was the Philippine Reservation, which played as a celebration of conquest and a tool for racial civilization propaganda. So this fair was officially titled the Louisiana Purchase Centennial Exposition, so 100 years since the Louisiana Purchase. This World Fair was meant to celebrate the civilization of the continent. It was believed that human history had reached its highest point. So throughout the fair, there were exhibits of various indigenous tribes and peoples that were brought into the country for this reason and this reason only. And they were to live on the grounds the entire time that they were in the country. There were other indigenous people at the World Fair, including the Ainu of Japan, Patagonians of the Andes, and various members of 51 of the First Nations of North America. But the Philippine Reservation was 47 acres, and it was the most popular attraction. The Philippine American War just ended, but there was still American troops. Their presence was still in the Philippines fighting off guerrillas at the time. So the exhibit was meant to celebrate conquest against rebels as propaganda for their conquest for racial civilization propaganda and social progress as well. So William Howard Taft, who, like I said, was the US military governor of the Philippines at the time, coordinated the collection and transport of the 1,000 inhabitants and 400 US aligned Filipino soldiers serving under white officers. He believed their exposure to civilization would be good to bring back to the Philippines. At the Philippine Reservation, the tribes ate dog, which plays into the stereotype that we commonly hear today. And even today, which is something that very much shocked me, even today, one of the neighborhoods in Missouri, in St. Louis, which is near the long gone exposition grounds, is called Dogtown because it's supposedly where they got their dogs. So people would laugh and gawk at them and protest if tribes would not, quote unquote, perform. There are reports of people throwing rocks at another exhibit. And this is just the sort of thing that people would do. But as you can see in the pictures, these folks interacted with Filipino tribes as some sort of amusement to them. So next, in 1916, on August 29th, we have the Jones Law. So this contained the first formal and official declaration of the US federal government's commitment to grant independence to the Philippines. But they would only allow this as soon as they had a stable government that had to be determined and approved by the US government. So it wasn't really on their terms. It was also more of a framework for a more autonomous government with certain privileges reserved to the United States to protect its sovereign rights and interests. And next, in 1930, for 4 days, we have the Watsonville Riots. So this was happening in Watsonville, California, where white men took out their anger on Filipino men for partnering and marrying white women and taking their jobs by hunting them down and attacking them and threatening to burn down the town. So for some context here, Filipinos were US nationals. They weren't aliens, quote unquote, they weren't citizens, but they had every right to be working in the United States. But because they didn't know their rights, employers exploited them by giving them the lowest wages amongst all ethnic laborers. They were introduced as strike breakers, working when others didn't, and to appease cross-ethnic mobilization. Filipinos were the favorite recruits among farm operators because they were resilient in harsh working conditions. They filled the growing demand for labor and were the dominant Asian farm labor force in California for the next 2 decades. Yet they were unwelcomed, threatened, exploited, and abused. With gender bias in immigration policy, out of 30,000 Filipino laborers, 1 in 14 were women. And because of this, they ventured for companionship outside their own ethnic group, angering white men. The Watsonville Riots started on January 18, 1930, when 500 men bombarded a Filipino dance club that invited 9 white women to dance there. They came with clubs and weapons with intentions to remove the women and burn the place down. The Filipino club owner threatened to shoot if the mob didn't leave, and they didn't, and the owner opened fire. 2 days later, on January 20th, a group of Filipino men met with a group of white men to settle the score, and the riots officially began from there. Hunting parties were organized, and white men organized like an army, bombarding their dance clubs, dragging men from their homes to beat them, throwing them off the Pajaro River Bridge, demolishing Filipino employed places, and shooting into Filipino homes and more. Police in Watsonville gathered as many Filipinos to guard them in the city council's chambers. Ensuing race riots resulted in the murder of 22-year-old Filipino farm laborer Fermin Tobera, who was shot through the heart while hiding in a closet at a bunkhouse in a Filipino labor camp. Tobera's body returned to the Philippines, where he was considered a martyr and symbol for Filipinos' fight for independence and equality. From Tobera's death also brought along fear of living in America, and many Filipinos were afraid to live there and would return back to the Philippines. And this sentiment continued in the state throughout time, which brings us to January 29, 1930, when the Stockton Filipino Clubhouse was bombed. So there were reports of a blue sedan passing the club and throwing an object that were reported. And somehow newspapers still blame the Filipinos for staging an attempt to arouse sympathy. The blast threw many from their beds. 2 Filipinos were held up by a man, but the events were not related by the police. But the police were soon called to the scene after midnight. Some Filipinos were blamed, saying that in the clubhouse, they were fully dressed, unharmed, and saying the bomb had to be placed instead of thrown. But when you think about it, when you think of immigrants coming to a country that they are unfamiliar with and are already oppressed, why in the world would they want to destroy something that gives them a sense of community and hope for sympathy? We're just going to wait for that to load a little. There we go. All right. So next we have in 1933, racial ambiguity that Filipinos very much go through. So in 1933, Salvador Roldan, he was an Ilocano Filipino man who was engaged to Marjorie Rogers, a white woman. Since 1880, California Civil Code prohibited marriage between white persons and, quote, Negroes, mulattoes, and Mongolians, but there was a confusion over whether Filipinos were considered Mongolians or not. And so they consulted ethnologists, anthropologists, and at the time, race was divided into five races. So white or Caucasian, yellow or Mongolian, Black or Ethiopian, red or American, and brown or Malay. So first, being considered Mongolian, Roldan was refused the marriage license, and other Filipino white couples were being denied marriage licenses as this case was happening. After consulting various anthropologists, Filipinos were found to be Malay race, thus making the marriage legal. The Los Angeles court agreed, therefore allowing the marriage. But shortly after, California amended the law to include members of the Malay race, thus prohibiting interracial marriages between whites and Filipinos in order for this to not occur again. In 1934, we have the Tigress Mcduffie Act. So this was enacted March 24th, 1934. And under the act, the 1935 Constitution of the Philippines was written and the Commonwealth of the Philippines was established. Before Philippine independence, the Tigress Mcduffie Act allowed the US to maintain military forces in the Philippines and call all military forces of the Philippine government into US military service. So they would be fighting representing America. The act also reclassified all Filipinos, including those living in the US already, as aliens instead of nationals for the purposes of immigration to America. Before this act, Filipinos were classified as US nationals and not citizens, so they could migrate pretty easily, but they weren't citizens unless they were born in the US. The act extended the Asian exclusion from the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 to Filipinos, making it harder for Filipinos in the US to go to the Philippines and not be able to return. In 1934 began the Filipino Repatriation Act. So this was a program that provided a one-way passage for single adults back to the Philippines. It served as an incentive for Filipinos to return to the Philippines voluntarily without officially deporting them. With the Tigress Mcduffie Act, it had a 50 immigrant quota per year for Filipinos to enter the country. And so with the one-way passage and a 50 immigrant quota, this created separation of families where they would go back to the Philippines and not be able to return if the quota was already met. Out of 45,000 reported Filipinos in the 1930 census, only 1,900 went back to the Philippines. Time magazine called this the quote, Philippine flop. The Repatriation Act was deemed unconstitutional by Supreme Court in 1940, and this was eventually succeeded by the Nationality Act of 1940 that allowed citizenship and naturalization under certain circumstances, such as race, ethnicity, basic verbal proficiency, and residency requirements. Next is the Rescission Act of 1946. So this was a law of the United States that was put into place that essentially made the service of Filipino soldiers that fought for the US in World War II null and removed their promised benefits. So some background, in July 1941, 5 years before the Rescission Act, FDR federalized forces in the Philippines into service. During World War II, over 200,000 Filipinos fought for the US against the Japanese. As a Commonwealth of the US before and during the war, Filipinos were American nationals. They were promised all the benefits for serving the US. They suffered heavy losses and casualties, estimated at 57,000 people and, in the now famous battles of Bataan and Corregidor. During the Bataan Death March, about 70,000 prisoners of war, both American and Filipino, marched 65 miles to Japanese internment camps where they were imprisoned under inhumane conditions. Many died on the way, 600 to 650 American deaths and 5,000 to 10,000 Filipino deaths. And what was the reason for this rescission? Quote, the United States gave the Philippines $200 million after the war, which was never even received. There was also the sentiment of them already going to be independent anyway on July 4th, 1946. Of the 66 countries that allied with the US, only Filipinos were denied military benefits. Between 1946 and 2009, a total of 63 years, benefits for Filipino veterans of World War II were enacted. In 1990, 44 years after the rescission, Filipino veterans gained the right to naturalization. 20,000 out of 200,000 who served, Filipino veterans were naturalized. In 2003, 57 years after the recession, VA health benefits were extended to Filipino American World War II veterans. In 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided a one-time $15,000 lump sum to surviving veterans who are US citizens and $9,000 to non-citizens. Acceptance of payment would deny the payer any future benefits. And official recognition came more than 70 years later on November 30, 2016, when Congress passed the Filipino World War II Veterans Congressional Gold Medal Act of 2015. And the last thing on our timeline, we're going to be talking about the American nursing labor demand and Filipino supply. So during American colonization, the US government authorized to recruit American teachers to establish the Philippines' new educational system. So this meant westernized schools, nursing schools, hospitals, and teaching the entire education system at the time to be more quote unquote civilized. This made it easy for Filipino nurses to be transferred to America where nursing labor was needed. By 1967, the Philippines became the global leader in exporting nurses to the US. So when we talk about the westernized education system, this was from the Repatriation Act of 1901, which authorized the colonial government to recruit American teachers to help establish the new educational system. They were taught agriculture, reading, grammar, geography, mathematics, general courses, housekeeping, athletics. In 1948, the US established the Exchange Visitor Program, EVP, inviting foreigners to temporarily study and gain work experience in the US, and only allowing participants to stay in the country for a maximum of 2 years. In the Cold War, this program aimed to encourage participants to take American culture and ideology and bring it back home to the Philippines. The program's launch also coincided with US nursing shortages after World War II. Hospital administrators said that people love to take care of their families, but nurses actually say it was from very unsafe and bad working conditions in hospitals. American hospitals struggling with staffing utilized the EVP to sponsor Filipino nurses to fill the deficit. In 1965, the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act granted migrant nurses the chance to petition to stay in the country permanently. US hospitals specifically looked for Filipino exchange nurses because they had been trained in an Americanized nursing curriculum and work culture. They were also fluent in English as a result of American colonial education and legacy. Since 1960, over 150,000 Filipino nurses have migrated to the US. And in 2019, 1 out of 20 registered nurses in the US were trained in the Philippines. That doesn't include the Filipino Americans that have been born and trained in America today. Former Filipino President Ferdinand Marcos saw the demand for Filipino nurses as a market they should take advantage of. Money from overseas would help economy in the Philippines, and this was something that was encouraged. We see this surge of demand and supply of Filipino nurses, especially during pandemics in American history. We see that in the AIDS crisis during the 1980s, where Americans refused to work and Filipinos filled that gap, regardless of unfair conditions and wages. Today, we see it in our COVID pandemic that's happening as we speak, with unfair nurse to patient ratios, PPE shortages, not enough beds in ICU and bedside, and Filipino nurses are still being very much utilized today. So folks, that is basically a quick run through of the timeline that we'll be talking about today. Obviously, there are so many other things in Filipino American history that was not covered tonight, but I hope that this enlightened you a little bit more. I'm now going to ask my two speakers to come on stage, quote unquote, and we can just talk a little bit. I would like to introduce Jenah Maravilla and Emilio Manuel Camu. Ate Jenah, you can go first if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'm so excited to be part of this panel and super excited that, y'all have been hosting this space for about 4 webinars now. So congratulations. Thank you so much for, thinking of me. So my name is Jenah Maravilla. I am from Houston, Texas. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'd like to also acknowledge the land I'm on. I'm on unceded Karankawa territory. A little bit about me. I am a community organizer. I am co-author of Filipinos in Houston, and then also a artist. So I do a lot of work in the AAPI community. Currently, I am, what am I doing? I'm doing a lot of things. Currently, I'm part of AAPI Voices. So if you go on Instagram, aapivoices.tx, it's a collective of 4 of us who are trying to push for K through 12 curriculum to include Asian American ethnic studies. So pretty excited about that. Currently, it's a lot of video production work, but we are aiming for more artistic and installation exhibition work. I am part of UniPro Texas, Filipino American Unity for Progress, Inc., Texas chapter, Filipino American National Historical Society, Houston, and Philippine X Artists of Houston. So I really rep our people hard, and I'm really excited for the conversation coming up. I'll pass it to Emilio.
Mabuhay sa inyong lahat. Ako po si Emilio. At mula sa Katagalogan at ibang nang binabati ko po ang mga pangunahing tao at taga-alaga ng lupaing Shoshone, Goshute, and Ute. Just recognizing and acknowledging the land that I'm on today, which is the land of the Shoshone, Goshute, and Ute, more commonly known as Salt Lake City. I am part of the OCA Utah chapter, as well as the Filipino American National Historical Society Utah chapter, and different community organizations here as well. I'm glad to be on this and with Jenah and Abing Lady to talk about Filipino American history.
Awesome. Thank you both. Yes, so the first question I want to just ask, so obviously we see a common theme of labor demand in American history, and Filipinos supplying that labor even in difficult situations. So they're working when no one else wants to. Why would you say that? Why do you think that that is? And do you see that sentiment continue today? Whoever wants to.
Okay, I'll go first. So like, first and foremost, I'd like to give a little background context to how I got to America. My own mother is a product of that kind of labor force. She came in as a nurse, and I was brought here at 2 years old, way in the early 90s, or as I heard high school students say, late 1900s.
No.
Yes, moment of silence for that. But yeah, to me, there's a quote that I heard that has resonated, which was, "We wouldn't be here if you weren't here first." So I believe that, and this is in regards to like us coming here for labor, whereas America came to the Philippines first, and plundered. So I think that nurses and other labor coming here to America to fulfill a need in times of danger, honestly, is not because of some humanitarian and extremely selfless reason. It's because of necessity. It's because the land that we have and the country that we came from has been exploited to the point where they have no choice but to think of leaving the country and coming here and dreaming of a better life and dreaming of a better future for their children, because it's just been so hard over there. Just from what, like, even now, I believe that I'm coming from a place of hearing my mom's stories, my dad's stories growing up, and having to help raise their younger siblings and send them to school, because that's the only hope they have to a better life. And I think it's just as simple as that, but it's also complex and complicated when it comes to the systems that had them get to this decision.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, in terms of this labor demand, it's not something it's necessitated because of the policies at the time, different forces at play. One of the major ones being colonialism, that necessitates all of these things to happen. When we look at Hawaii, and the laborers, the labor farm workers that were used there, a big force came from the Filipinos, mostly the Ilocanos and Cebuanos. But then, you see this rotating with Japanese, with Chinese, and as a result of larger forces at play after 1882, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, if their labor wasn't coming from China, where else could they go? They saw the Pacific, Philippines as part of that, and looking into just this, this expansion and imperialism of the U.S. And where that led. And we see that even repeat in California, with the farm workers there, or even in Alaska with the canneries. It's not just Filipino farm workers, It's Mexican, it's Punjabi Sikh, it's Japanese, and we see all of these patterns in history that are affected by policies that require or target Filipinos to come to the U.S. So there's a lot of different push and pull factors for that, But it's this overall. It's part of this overall equation of policy. And, a lot of people now, when they talk about Filipinos, attribute, our caring nature, our sense of bayanihan, as a major factor of majority of us becoming nurses, or Filipino American communities. And for those on the call here, a virtual raise of hands, or even just think to yourself, how many Filipinos do you know who is either a nurse or has a family member who is a nurse? And I'm sure everyone's hands would come up. And I think that's part of this labor. If you haven't, if you'd like to delve more into this, particularly within nursing, I think Dr. Catherine Sanisa Choi, wrote this in her book in Empire of Care, talking about this strategic. What's it called? This is the strategic a way of educating nurses in the Philippines who are ready to be exported, as people, for labor demand that you couldn't meet in the US or elsewhere. And you see that not just now, during the COVID pandemic, but even before, during the HIV/AIDS pandemic, where when there were labor shortages, or when there is a labor shortage now, who is disproportionately affected in our, particularly in our nursing workforce, I think it was LA Times that came out with an article that 1/3 of all nurses who have died during the COVID pandemic have been nurses of Filipino descent, Filipino immigrants, Filipino Americans, people who were born here. It disproportionately affects us as part of this result. And so it's not necessarily us filling in for things. It's the way that our people are targeted because of this historic relationship that we have with different places. Yeah.
I wanted to add on to that, and how Filipinos are exported for their labor. Actually, I think that Philippines' #1 export is people, and out of that, it continues to subjugate the sorry, my words are leaving me, but yeah, it continues to subjugate the what is it called when maunlad like it stops the country from growing into more first world, second world economic state. And from what I hear, there's the system is called degree mills, You go into the country expecting to have a labor force that is to be exported. They know that they're going to go to school, and it doesn't matter if it's for hotel management. It doesn't matter if it's for cruise ships or even just more service-oriented industries. And all of them know that they will be leaving the country. Like that's just part of the culture. And I believe that it also feeds into the lack of pride, so to speak. Like there is definitely a shallow Filipino pride, like you're proud of the country you're from and you're proud of knowing people who are from the same area, but there isn't that deeper sense of nationalism that could have helped in terms of independence and in terms of economic growth and viability within the country itself. Yeah, stymie is a good word for it.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, it's so interesting because these are concepts that it's so interesting to me as I was going through it that have been affecting us for so long and still do and continue to affect us so strongly today. Like just in terms of narrative, in terms of experience, like it's something that we really all relate with. So when we talk about supplying this labor demand and degree mills, right? How do you think that plays into the model minority myth, and has that affected you in any way?
Like yes and yes. Yes, it does play into. I mean, it's part of this like overall structure, right? I think when we talk about model minority myth, right, it's about perhaps the Filipino Americans complicated because right there's such a variety, not just overall of Asians, but when you look at Filipinos like us on the screen, right, we already vary in our appearance, we already vary in the different ethnic groups, etc., that we come from. But not only that, because of this whole this necessity for disaggregated data that model minority tries to mask with aggregated data that says, oh, Asian Americans are good, Asian Americans, statistically doing well, everyone else needs to catch up, right? We all know that's a myth. But I think, the Filipino, once we include Filipino American history, like, wait a minute, that the existence of Filipino American history and experience, I think, kind of negates that, right? When we look at the past, 120 years, so starting 1900, we already see, right, there's this historic relationship starting with the, Spain deciding to cede away a country that they didn't own, with the, us as a country, right, trying to, fight for autonomy and sovereignty. But that happening at a time, too, where, at a time, the Philippines was considered only as Luzon, Visayas, and then part of the Marshall Islands and Guam, right? And then all of these things that affect it. And I think, as part of that, we look further into the earlier 1900s, conversely from the later 1900s, but earlier 1900s where there's the scholars, right? The government-funded scholars that were coming from rich families coming to the U.S. as pensionados. And what they were doing here was to be educated, right? To be able to go back home and run the family business, which is government, and be able to do that. And I think, we're seeing different levels of class here as well that play out within the model minority. We look more into just like recent Filipino American history, and we'll see just the vast difference in their experience due to social class, right? When we're talking about nurses and other labor, they're skilled professionals, yes, but they're also supporting quote unquote lower income lower socioeconomic families that are not just single family homes, but it's multi-generational, and all of these different things that really, I think, affect and negate, right, the model minority myth. Personally, I think yes, I am affected, right? As systems work, as oppression works, right? The individual me is affected by this because in terms of the support, right, that I try to seek in terms of even just the college going experience. When they saw, I was like, we don't know where that is, but when they're like, but you're Asian, so we know you kind of don't need the support. that, you know, that helps erase, right, this whole history that not myself, but our people have had with the US.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. I feel like when we look at how the migration waves came in with the completely varying types of jobs that we were supposed to fill in, that already gives us class differences that we can't really put onto a graph, especially clumped together with other Asian Americans, and especially with Pacific Islanders who are going through completely different struggles and plights than our own citizens. When I think of the model minority myth and I think of those different occupations that Filipinos fill in, we think of East Coast, we think of West Coast, and then here I am in Texas, where our wave started in the 60s, and it started with nurses. And in the 60s, it was still segregated. So what were those nurses considered? Were they considered Black or white? And we thankfully have a couple of nurses who are vocal about their experiences back in the day. One of them is Manang Joanna Poe. If you look her up, Joanna space P-O, she is literally the mother of radiology nursing. And she wrote the book on it. And she came here in the 60s. And one of the first events that I ever saw her in was a Filipino American National Historical event where she had spoken on her story coming in and the racism she experienced. And how she wasn't considered white. So she was considered colored, and she would have to be night shift because that's the only shift they were allowed to have. She wouldn't be able to go up in ranking as a nurse. She just all of these stories and wealth of information that we wouldn't have known otherwise coming in the 90s. And then also that distinction of experiences. She had no idea about the labor movements in the West Coast at the same time. And in learning about the Delano Manos, she actually started crying. And she said, you know, because one of the questions in the panel that she was sitting in was, how come, you know, y'all weren't able to help the other Filipinos going through what they were going through? And she said herself that, how can I help what I do not know? And I think that speaks to the larger oppression of our stories, not just as Filipino Americans, but as minorities, as Asian Americans throughout history, that, you know, the solidarity amongst our people is necessary, and that includes education.
Wow. Yeah. To you both, it's so interesting, like that, like what all of these generations before us went through coming to America, and the different experiences of racial ambiguity, of like miscommunication, of disinformation. And I think it's so interesting because, you know, they like looking at America as the land of opportunity, as a place to, you know, provide for their family back at home, which is something that we still do today, where like today my parents still pay for like all of their nephew and niece's college in the Philippines. Like they are seen as like breadwinners, even like, you know, as much as they can, like they have raised their family up to like give them some sort of opportunity to go to nursing school and do different things like that. And so, you know, do you think that Filipinos, you know, in coming to America, or even Filipinos in the Philippines right now, that they look at the country of America as a place of like opportunity, or like they look at the American dream as like a dream to try to achieve, or like or a kind of goal to go after?
I can go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, when you talked about, you know, remittances, right? That's what they're called when we send money back to the Philippines. When you speak on remittances, my first thought was like, I wish FAFSA had a a section where we could fill out how much our money is, or how much our family's money is going there, because I know that that was a big chunk of what was happening growing up, especially when there was talks of me going to college, right? That's a huge difference in terms of funding than when my parents help out my cousins in the Philippines. But to answer your question on whether the American dream is still something they believe in over in the Philippines, honestly, I think it has to do with class. If the family in the Philippines is at least middle class, whatever that means in that, you know, culture, um, I don't think so. I think that thankfully, because of the internet, there is a lot more um, knowledge spread about how life actually is here versus the, you know, fairy tales that my parents grew up with. And so I don't know, I feel like my cousins more want to go to Korea than here. Let's be real.
Yeah, I've seen that pattern too, right? And I think, but earlier in the mid 2000s or even just starting 2000s, it was the Middle East, right? Saudi and Kuwait, and all of these places.
You're right.
Yeah.
And
UK.
in the 90s, it's Hong Kong, London, UK, Europe, and I think it's just right. The part of this larger thing. I don't know if it's like following the dream, but it's just searching for more opportunity because they're not seeing it there. I think you see, right, when we're talking about Filipino Americans specifically, right, and how we started here, I mean, everyone was looking for a better life. And you know, we look to Guam, we look to the Marshall Islands, we look to where else? I'm like, where else are the little colonies of the U.S.? But there are Filipinos there, right? Because of this shared history that we have, when Spain gave away, right, the Philippines to the U.S., right, part of Guam, Puerto Rico, et cetera, you know, those are still part of our shared history and legacy that I think, you know, when we were talking about, right, racial ambiguity for Filipinos, that I think one of y'all said earlier, you know, whether we're Asian or Pacific Islander, et cetera, I'm like, well, part of that is a cause of this, right? It's an effect of this legacy of colonization and imperialism. And I think that's where the difficulty lies. But in terms of, you know, people still believing it, I think, you know, they're believing in that there is just better opportunity outside of the Philippines, as it's necessitated by trying to just find a better life for their family. And then when we get here, right, and I think that some of the experiences people, even, you know, newer Filipino immigrants in the U.S. are experiencing is the same that they may have been experiencing in the 60s, right? It's that struggle for assimilation or preservation of culture, that we talk about, right? Like second, third gen, even maybe fourth gen Filipino Americans who may not necessarily even identify as Filipino anymore, or, you know, are maybe not as rooted in the culture, or, you know, don't quote unquote speak a language. But I think, you know, that's part of this this larger discussion that we need to have, you know, for what is the cause of this, right? I think it was recently when I was looking through Facebook that, you know, people were sharing that joke of like, oh, you know, Filipino nurses can't speak in Tagalog because you know, they could get what is it called? They could get penalized because of the way that they say in their accent, right? That English speaking patients might misunderstand them and they can get fired. And I'm like, haha, yeah, sure, that's a joke. But it's actually rooted, right, in the real treatment of Filipino laborers here. And, you know, not just of now, but historically. And, you know, again, looking just since 1900s, what has our history been here, right? And we're looking at maybe, I think a big talk right now in, I think, our age group of Filipino American quote unquote youth, is, you know, like toxic Filipino American traits, right? And where do those stem from? But I think, you know, those stem from a lot of different things because of what's called unmet I'm losing my words too. Wow. What is it called? Unmet need. I don't know. Unmet need, or something along those lines where, you know, looking at our 120-year history, we've had war, right? We've had, we see in the 30s, right, that the Filipino Repatriation Act, when the US granted independence to the Philippines, there were a lot of people who were here that chose to not came back, who were classified as nationals, but then all of a sudden, right, became undocumented within the US's eyes. We see in the 60s, and even till now, a lot of family separation, right? A lot of people not just split between, you know, the Philippines and the US, but the US and different parts of the world for this. But, you know, I think the largest being, right, the Filipinos in the US diaspora, and all of this, right, separation in a sense, that is an effect of all of these historical things that have happened. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate that our communities don't get to know like the history timeline that you had, or even, you know, a lot of the works that the great organizations like FONS is pushing through. But I think little by little we are getting there, so that our communities not just are getting more aware, but are, you know, trying to take back our history and our cultures in the way that it is now, and you know, helping us move forward.
Wow. Yes. Thank you both. Definitely. I think this is going to be my last question before we go into a quick Q&A. So I want to ask, like, what do you think in terms of like, how am I trying to say this? In coming to America, I'm losing my words too. In coming to America, and the effects that, you know, generational trauma has existed in our community, and, you know, coming to America and dealing with that. And then, you know, like older generations not knowing how to deal with it, or just kind of going into like other like defense mechanisms in a way. And then that kind of projecting onto younger generations of Filipino Americans, onto their children and things like that. How do you think that's affected our community as a whole, like in terms of what we bring to the table? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, I think I can go first. I know I'm trying to like find the right words too. So thank you all to all the attendees that are still here on a Friday as we're all trying to, you know, jumble our brains back together. That's a great point, Ading, because I think that's what I mean. At least, you know, Facebook and subtle Filipino traits, we see a lot of that, right? And for me, I'm hoping that our community members, young and old, right, can come to terms with the fact that there is still a lot of trauma that are not just ourselves, but even our parents and grandparents are facing, that, you know, perhaps we don't know how to deal with because of all these different factors, right? Official or unofficial policy that has affected them, and they're, you know, need to move here or having been brought here. For us, as just trying to find, you know, reconnection or whatever it may be back into the Filipino community. But, you know, I'm not, I studied in education and in history, but I'm not a therapist or counselor, right? But, and you know, I say that because I think there's a lot of coming to terms that our community has to do, but not forgetting that we have to see that, you know, a lot of this trauma is I think a lot of it, not all of it, but a major factor in them is these different things in the history that have happened to us, right? When we're talking specifically in the US, right? The Watsonville Riots, the ceding of Spain, Spain ceding the Philippines to the US in 1898, that us all from becoming nationals into aliens in the 30s and 40s, from the Immigration Nationalization Act in 1965, and then like quotas being placed on our people to see how many could come and not come. All of that affects, right, these different relationships that we have, and the trauma that, you know, perhaps other families, you know, are certainly carrying. And I really hope, you know, I think through the work of FONS and through the work of OCA, that we're able to, you know, not just connect what has happened in history to how our communities are now, but that we're able to also keep moving in a direction that acknowledges, right, all of these things that have happened. Right. And can unify our people in that understanding.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that unification of our ideals, of our morals, is definitely one of the things that we should do to help unpack everything that's gone on and continues to go on. Who knows what kind of trauma the nurses today are facing because of COVID, going strong for a couple of years now. I lost my sense of time. But yeah, like I want to say what we bring to the table is more than our resilience. I want to say what we bring to the table is our innate sense of kapwa, and kapwa is how we see ourselves in the other person. I think that has brought us through so much of what we've gone through, and I think that we just need more spaces, not only in which we acknowledge the trauma that we've been through, but also spaces in which we do actionable things towards the benefit of our community, whether it's mentally, emotionally, community wise. There's the education through FilVet Rep, which I linked into the comments, Filipino Veteran Representation and Educational Project. They're also working on a curriculum called Duty to Our Country or something like that, Duty to Serve, which is now available for people to take. So definitely check their website out. But alongside that, I think of Encanto. I think of that new Disney movie that just came out, and how, there's a lot of hate for the grandma. There's a lot of, but you don't think of what she had to go through to get to where they are, and how the trauma of, losing her whole village, losing her husband, and raising 3 children on her own. What does that do to a person? You're not going to be all sunshine and roses after that. And I believe that that's the same with whatever generation that precedes us, and even the generation currently going through a lot of things. And I hope that with the increased talk about mental health awareness, that at least our generation will be a lot more mindful of breaking those cycles and of talking about these things at the dinner table, because that's where it starts, honestly, especially with our people, breaking bread, and getting our older generation to come through at these organizations like FONS and OCA, and the countless others that deal with and hold space for all these types of topics.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. Those are beautiful answers. So now we will go into a quick Q&A session. I know we're running a little late, so we have one question, and I will try to, I know Jenah has to go in a bit, but okay. So we have one question here. Kuya Emilio kind of touched on it, but how does colonial mentality affect Filipino identity? I know those are deep questions.
Filipino itself, right? It's still a marker of, right? We're still the islands of Spain, the subjects of Spain. So, I think it goes hand in hand, right? Unless you decide to tackle it head on by learning our histories, by engaging in our communities, by building on that and leaning on the pakikipagkapwa with other Filipino people. By everything that Ate Jenah was saying earlier, and the space that we always continue to create with each other like this.
Yeah, I think that, if you haven't already read Brown Skin, White Minds by E.J.R. David, I think that's a great intro to colonial mentality and how it affects Filipino-ness. With my own Filipino identity, I am constantly trying to unlearn the subjugation of our people, even through simple acts of the jokes of like pinching your child's nose to make it taller and things like that. Like, let's just stop. you know, it starts with those very little things.
Yeah, I think I want to touch on it too a little bit. I think it's interesting because when like there are so many moments with Filipino identity where, you know, we look at our culture and we look at, you know, the food that we eat and the traditions that we have and like, you know, the way that we express ourselves like culturally. There are moments where you're like, is this ours? Or is this, you know, when we realize like the roots that it comes from is from like colonialism and like, you know, where people ask like, is anything actually ours? And like, what is ours? And that does come into going into Filipino spaces and learning the history and learning why things are and finding, you know, an identity through that, like a shared identity through the experiences. And I think that's a huge part of what Filipino identity comes from is from like, yes, like, you know, colonial mentality as in like, you know, there are things that we have that are in our culture that was placed upon us like against our will, and so we've adopted them in a way to adapt and to try to, you know, assimilate and in terms of like safety and in terms of like survival. But I think it is in the shared experiences that play into our shared Filipino identity, and that we've grown and like made something out of it.
That's a beautiful way of speaking about it, because I know that, like, as Emilio had first mentioned, that you can't really completely decolonize. You cannot completely, as much as we want to, as much as it would be nice to get back to our pre-colonial roots, what does that even mean? What does that even look like? How do we even function in that way, especially with the years and years and onslaught of colonization? I think all we can really do is honor the indigeneity that continues to live past the oppression.
Awesome. Well, I think that is it for the questions. I will have some resources really quick just to share with everyone on how you can support the Filipino and Filipino American community really quick. I know, Jenah, if you have to go, I will not keep you. But just really quick, Emilio, if you wanted to go through them, because you've been going through them the whole time.
Yeah, so if you want to just go through some more extensive historical timelines, there's a well-good digital archive that was compiled by the Bulasan Center for Filipino Studies, first ever in the West Coast in California. I forgot which school. I think it's UC Davis. So go look into these two and Filipino Studies at wordpress.com/historical timeline. It gives a, not more complete. There is more events, but of course it can never be complete. There's always things happening. Supporting the Filipino American National Historical Society, supporting Filipino businesses, artists, and other representation. There's also the Bataan Memorial Death March on March 20th happening, organized through you can find out more on bataanmarch.org and through filvetrep.org, as well as fighting and bringing API history to your local K-12 curriculum. And if you're a student, continue to take ethnic studies and API studies at your local colleges, as well as becoming an active OCA member and just engaging in your Asian and Pacific Islander communities in your state, your Filipino communities in your state. I think, it's quote unquote easy to get involved. If you find a Filipino event, there's sure to be some food. I think we're welcoming in that sense that we're always welcoming to help build community, to fight for justice. And to do these things right on a family level, and making sure that we can introduce these things and raise awareness one person at a time.
Oh, love that. I just want to note about the Bataan Memorial March. I've personally done the in-person one 3 years ago. It's 2018. And and it was amazing. It was I was literally in White Sands Missile Range, where it's a desert and it's 14 miles long. And I'm not fit, so that was it can be done. But yeah, thank you again for hosting this space, and thank you for having this discussion with me.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you to Kuya Emilio, Manuel, Camu, and Jenah Maravilla. Both of you are such amazing resources of knowledge and wisdom, I will say, and you just add so much representation to our Filipino American community. And I just really thank you both so much for your time and for being with us tonight. And I hope everyone else has a great night. If you have any other questions, you can email them to me and then I can pass them on to Emilio and to Jenah. But once again, everyone, thank you all so much. This is the last history webinar of our series, AAPI, Hate Crimes in History, they're not new. It has been a pleasure to be speaking to so many different communities in the AAPI sphere, from the Chinese and Japanese American community for Vincent Chin, for East Asians, for the Pacific Islander communities, for South Asian communities, and now for Southeast Asian and the Filipino community. So it has been just a blast to just do so much research and find out all the history and talk to such amazing people throughout. So I just want to thank everyone who supported and for OCA for creating this platform for us to speak and to just bring to the table such amazing people. And I hope everyone has a great night. And yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.
Salamat.
Salamat.
Thank you. Bye. Ingat.
Ingat kayo.